And please do not...
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can start. Dear Minister, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking now to all of us sitting here in Creative Hub in Tallinn, but also to all our internet guests who can see us through the camera and their screens. I'm very pleased and honored to welcome at the 9th European Remembrance Symposium. This annual event gathers, this time in a hybrid form, people of different nationalities, professions and academic disciplines who shared the same interests in the 20th century history and memory and who take actions in this area. The reason why we are here, the reason why we meet here is to support international cooperation with possible future common project in mind, organized by you, of course. During the next 3 days, in panel discussions, networking sessions, and backstage conversations, we will exchange knowledge and ideas. Sometimes we will also express doubts and confront different perspectives. We will share results of our projects, show off our achievements, and inspire one another. We will establish new contacts and possible partnerships. In doing that, we will be making another step ahead in developing a European culture of memory, a culture of memory of European nations, a culture of memory of Europeans. The Tallinn edition of the symposium was supposed to take place in spring 2020. Although the pandemic, which forced us to postpone the event twice, has not ended yet, I'm very glad that I can finally welcome at least so many of you here in person. I would like to thank the NRS team as well as the Estonian Institute of Historical Memory who worked tirelessly to make this event happen. I would like to express my gratitude to our partners, the Federal Institute for Culture and History of the Germans in Eastern Europe, the Nations Memory Institute from Slovakia, the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Tallinn, the Embassy of the Republic of Lithuania to the Republic of Estonia, and the Liszty Institute, the Hungarian Culture Center in Tallinn. Thank you very much for your support. And now I have an honor of introducing the next speaker, Madame Maris Lauri, Minister of Justice of the Republic of Estonia. Minister, the floor is yours.
Tere! Tere, lugupeetud Euroopa mälusümpoosiumist osavõtjad! 20. sajand on ilma kahtluseta üks murrangulisemaid aegu maailma ajaloos. 2 maailmasõda, teaduse ja tehnika revolutsioon,
of science and technology, development in women's rights, establishment countries in Europe and elsewhere in the world, deep economic and political crises, bloody conflicts, fundamental changes in society. Alongside good things, bad things also took place, atrocious ideologies, some of which, and I hope forever, found their end. Standing here today, we feel that the world is truly interconnected, but at the same time, there is a lot of disagreement. But all of this has come from the past century. We remember events differently, even if we are in the midst of the same event, together at the same time. But looking at the past, we see that this comes through our parents, grandparents, our work, friends and acquaintances. These differences increase. Some of us have read history books, others have experienced an historical event themselves. All this experience breeds stories, and history is really just a story of stories. But then interpretations come into play, and these are somewhat different for every individual. We, as Central and Eastern European nations, have different memory reflections than in Western Europe, for example. For us, it's not the World War I that's truly important, but what came after that's important. It meant victory for many and defeat for others. Many small nation states became independent, but then were left in the midst of reckoning of large states. History, like every story, is for learning from mistakes and successes, to avoid them or repeat them. Have we thought about what is just punishment, and when does punishment become revenge? What feeds resentment and covert hostilities that at one point become bloody revenge? Are we able to look at political, economic and social processes together? If national pride, which every nation has, is hurt, and there are other pressures, especially deterioration of economic situation, then the outcome may be extremely toxic. The 20th century demonstrates just that, a crisis of democracy as a result of which Hitler, Mussolini, Franco and Stalin came to power. This took place with accolades of the people. Were all these nations collectively crazy? If changes are too fast for people, then the economy and people do badly, then people start looking for those who are guilty and seeking a strong hand, a true leader. Maybe this is where the answer lies to the question, how could it happen that in the past century, in the 30s and 40s, authoritarian politicians took power in many European countries who led Europe 20 years after the atrocious war to a war with even more victims in 1939. We must learn from these events and stories. In some sense, we are also in an era of great changes with the COVID pandemic and economic problems. Developments of technology and research have been so fast that adjusting to the changes is more and more difficult for many. It tires people out and makes them insecure. And today, 100 years later, we are still in a situation where globally populist forces are raising their heads, playing on people's emotions. Never after the end of the Cold War has the world been in such conflict. How did we come to that point? How can we exit the situation in such a way that we don't create more strife within and outside societies? And how do we avoid violence? I think we have a lot to learn from this past century, including World War I and its aftermath. Let's think about the fact that in the end we're all people. In December 1914, in Belgium, in the Plukstert village, German and British soldiers exited the trenches, put weapons down, and had a soccer match. They exchanged gifts and held funeral services for their compatriots who fell in the war. For a brief Christmas moment, soldiers forgot that they were enemies and focused on the fact that they're human. They sought what connects them, not what divides them. We too should look at Europe as a cooperation project that makes all of us stronger. To look for what connects us, not at what divides us. Listen to each other and try to understand. Though we may have many different perspectives, so that we would never have to stand alone again in defending our freedom. And that is why we need history, the story of stories. We need those who remember history, tell the stories of history and interpret history. Without remembering history, we have no stable common Europe, nor the wisdom to learn from mistakes made. This is why you have gathered here. And I wish you lots of wisdom and strength to discuss, listen, contemplate, and bring it back to your societies. All the best to you, and thank you.
Madam Minister, thank you for those moving words. Very important words for us. Thank you very much. 2 months ago, on the 23rd of August, we commemorated together the European Day of Remembrance for the victims of totalitarian regimes. To commemorate this day, every year the ENRS produced a short film dedicated to one of those whose lives were significantly affected by dramatic fight against totalitarianism. I would like to invite you now to watch a clip made for 2021. It is about an acclaimed Estonian writer, Jan Kross, who became a symbol of resistance against totalitarianism and the conscience of the Estonian people. It will be a 30-second film.
How to remain human in an unhuman world. A short guide based on the works of Jan Kross, an Estonian writer. Be a member of a family, a team, a fraternity, a neighborhood, not a crowd, a mob, or a clique. Love your language, cherish your tradition, respect all the people you meet, regardless of their background. Try, fight, struggle when you can, but when you simply can't, learn to compromise. You are of no use to anyone if you're dead. Don't leave, stay put. Be where they force you to be. Stay there, like an iron pin in the body of the empire. Jan Kross was a genius storyteller who put Estonia on the literary map of the world. A prisoner of German Nazi occupants, a slave in Russian gulag. He returned to his hometown Tallinn and put his talent to work. In a long-term game of cat and mouse with Soviet censorship, he managed to inspire millions. He remained human. He survived 2 totalitarian regimes and lived to enjoy Estonia's independence. Remember him.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask Mr. Sergei Metlev, from Estonian Institute of Historical Memory, to have the floor.
Madam Minister, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, here and at your computers, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you here in Tallinn's Creative Hub. On behalf of the Estonian Institute of Historical Memory, the hosting institution of the 9th edition of the symposium. Thank you for coming here despite all the problems that pandemic had created. The European Remembrance Symposium is one of the most important forums in Europe dedicated to the exchange of knowledge and experience in the field of European recent history. Just 4 decades ago, today's gathering here would be impossible, because half of Europe, including Estonia, was living under a communist dictatorship, which crafted its own so-called history that didn't tolerate pluralism and disallowed the scientific research of the past. Talking philosophically, it is crucial to keep in mind that in the long chain of history of Europe and widerly Western civilization, it is overwhelmed with conflicts and hostility. However, the link in the chain where we currently exist is positively exceptional. This event here is a clear demonstration of that. As a result of the division by the Iron Curtain, many of us have different perceptions about the 20th century in Europe. We tend to highlight different events and episodes. Countries have different experience with totalitarianism or don't have it at all, luckily. At the same time, there is always a wider context for the political, economical, and cultural developments of our societies. And there are many value-based bridges between the historical memories of our countries. And I think that movie that we just saw is one of the demonstrations of that. Let's build those bridges stronger during the next 3 days. During the symposium, we will discuss the possibility of creating a common culture of remembrance in Europe. We will go through memories, for conflicts of memories, different narratives, and analyze them. We will observe the role of remembrance institutions and civic organizations in maintaining peace and keeping the historical facts always on the top of the public discussion. We will ask, what role does recent history play in European identity? Before I finish, some words about this fascinating venue. The building of Creative Hub was completed as Tallinn City Central Power Plant in 1913. After a long time being out of use, this stunning industrial complex was reopened in 2015 as a renovated Universal Creative Center and Center for Events. The industrial interior of the complex has inspired legendary filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. Some scenes of his famous Stalker movie was filmed just 100 meters away from this spot. This venue was the center of Estonia's presidency in the European Union in 2018. The leaders of European Union nations gathered for a summit in this hall just where you sit at the moment. So quite a lot of different interesting connections with the recent history. Please enjoy the symposium and have a nice time in the wonderful city of Tallinn. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergei. This is really impressive place and impressive city. For the first time in the history of Symposium, another project by the ENRS takes place in the same city at the same time. We opened yesterday, that not far away from here, at the Freedom Square, we opened our traveling outdoor exhibition after the Great War in New Europe 1918-1923. I would like to encourage you to try to find time between panels and networking sessions and visit the exhibition. To give you a sample of what you might expect, we will now watch a short video invitation from Professor J. Winter. it will be not maybe so moving as a previous film, but very informative.
I'm very happy to introduce this exhibition on the new Europe, 1918 to 1923. It was a time very much like our own, filled with innovation and instability. It is a moment that reminds us where we came from 100 years ago to create a Europe that is still on the way to being realized. These images show the mix of violence and new vistas of life that were opened in 1918. Some countries found peace in 1918, others still remained in war. Some countries gained their independence, some countries lost it. What we can see at the photograph on the bottom is burning buildings in the civil war in Finland, which directly followed the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and produced the worst civil war in Finland's memory. It involved civilian casualties of a kind that were unusual for the First World War, but became characteristic for the years 1918 to 23 that followed. The years after the First World War were among the most unstable in all of European history. Here we see an image of children building castles with money that was worthless. If you came to an opera in 1923, by the time you got to the second act, the price of your ticket had gone up by 100%. The value of money was destroyed by the war and the hyperinflation that followed it. Those who worry about economic stability should look at 1918 to 23 to see what it really looked like. The years after 1918 were years of innovation, years of new roles for women, many of whom got the vote as a result of the war. New industries, new forms of communication, transformation. The innovations that took place in the 1920s are less well known than the violence, but nonetheless the innovations have lasted longer. This is a description of the peace treaty that settled the war between the Allies and Austria. Austria didn't exist in 1914, and it was treated very harshly in the treaty that followed it. And it is remembered as one of the moments when the country declined from the status of an enormous empire to that of a small country. This exhibition reflects a recovery of a memory that once was strong and now has faded away. It's time to restore it because the memory of Eastern Europe is part of the European history, which is the basis of the European Union. No history, no union. This recovery of memory is a recovery of political stability. Here at Verdun, we stand in an alley of remembrance with a medieval knight looking over the town, which gave birth to 20th century warfare, as if modern language was incapable of expressing the immense enormity of what took place here, and they went back to the medieval times to make sense of what war was. This is the violent beginning of the new Europe that the exhibition explores for us.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, to all of you gathered here in Tallinn Creative Hub and to all online participants, I wish you a fruitful meeting. Good time in Tallinn, good time during the symposium. Please welcome to the 9th European Remembrance Symposium. Thank you for being with us.
Good afternoon. I would like just to invite our first panelists to the opening session. Tomasz Hio, the moderator, the co-moderator, Dr. Monika Karaniskaute, Dr. Michał Łuczewski, Professor Wiaczesław Morozow, and Dr. Gergely Brule will be attending online if he manages to connect, because we know that he has some technical issues. And Professor Elazar Barkan, who is already with us online. Thank you very much.
Good day, everyone. Can you hear me?
Excellencies, academics, professors, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I have a big honor to moderate this first panel of our symposium. Fortunately, I am not the only moderator today. Second moderator will be Professor Elazar Barkan from United States, but he is here on screen, and he will open our panel. But at first, I say some words about him. I hope you have his biography also in materials you have handed, but anyway. Professor Barkan is Professor of International and Public Affairs and the Director of the Human Rights Concentration at the School of International and Public Affairs of Columbia University, New York. His research interests focus on human rights and on the role of history in contemporary society and politics and the response to gross historical crimes and injustices. Professor Barkan was the founding director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague. He serves on the board of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, Columbia University. Previously, Professor Barkan served as chair of the History Department and the Cultural Studies Department at the Claremont Graduate University, California, where he was the founding director of the Humanities Center. Professor Barkan has studied history and received his PhD from Brandeis University, Massachusetts. And Professor Barkan, please.
Good day, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I guess my role is in this case is to give a brief outline of the historical background of where we are. It all started after the war with the Nuremberg trial, which brought Nazi leaders to trial for crimes against peace, for war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It was not for the genocide that the Nazis perpetrated, a concept that did not exist, and not for the Holocaust. The focus on Nuremberg trials was on states, not on victims. This has changed somewhat, or began to change, with the Eichmann trial in the early 60s in Israel, in which the first time that the victims played a major role in the indictment, capturing the attention of the public. This was limited mostly to the West at the height of the Cold War. Central and Eastern Europe were under Soviet occupation and did not experience nor were exposed to the trial. It was followed by other trials, but not yet in a shift of identity. In the 1970s and the 1980s, the place of the Holocaust in public culture grew. The young generation in Germany was open to confront their parents' generation as part of the youth upheaval against the establishment. Particularly important episode was the TV miniseries Holocaust in 1978, which became popular and brought the concept into public discussion, the concept of Holocaust, and was internalized in German identity as perpetrators. This was the first time the Holocaust became a word in German. The depiction of complicity of the Poles with the Nazis were criticized by the Polish diaspora. But the two sets of memories evolved concurrently. By the 1980s, the debates over the Holocaust became mainstream contention, primarily in Germany, and was growing in intensity. For example, the historians' debate and the inclusion of population as complicit in the crimes intensified the centrality of the Holocaust to the German identity. In the West, the balance of the public attention to the legacy of World War II was focusing more on victims, especially of the Holocaust, as the growth of human rights was expanding. The Holocaust became the emblem to which victims of mass violence, including ethnic cleansing, genocide, were comparing themselves to. The Holocaust became a measure. In time, German victims of World War II were demanding recognition too, primarily the Sudeten and the civilians in Dresden were the most vocal. Recognition of mass violence was growing worldwide, and accountability became a mainstream demand. For example, the women's movement, the human rights movement, the third wave of democratization, and redress became the core of public sphere. At the same time, the end of the Soviet Union was accelerating. And in the 1990s, we saw the transformation of Central and Eastern Europe, where on one hand, integrating into Western Europe became a primary policy goal, while on the other hand, the experience of the Soviet occupation was ignored by the West. The 1990s also saw the crimes of war in the Balkans and in Rwanda, which were constantly comparing itself to the Holocaust. Redress and accountability became the center of public discourse. Memory culture led to diverging memories, and while Germany became the symbol of a country that admits its guilt, and in most cases engage in redress, other countries in the West followed the degree in admitting culpability. Central East European countries focus on their own victimization but ignore culpability with the Nazis. This is a choice that doesn't have to be made, but was the historical fact. All that came into focus in 2000 with the Stockholm Declaration. While the Central and Eastern European countries were part of the organization, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, their focus was on including the Soviet crimes and denying all nationalist responsibility. That's the core of the dilemma. The most recent international conflict over responsibilities is aggravated in the relationship between Poland and Israel and is the subject of memory laws as a tool to fix the denials of collaborators. The historical truth continues to be a measure, and the international community, primarily the professional historians, shapes the manner of which these claims are received. Let me focus for a second on the Polish case briefly. The Polish memory law has two parts. The extermination camps was Nazi, not Polish, claiming that the Poles took part in perpetrating crimes is defamation. The first claim is correct and embraced by everyone. This was not a complicated issue to emphasize that the extermination camps were Nazi. The second claim, that Poles did not take part in complicity and in perpetrating crime, was false and has become a topic of contention between Poland and other countries. The memory of the Holocaust is a political, national topic which shapes the European identity, but not exclusively, as it engages many other countries in the world. This is the topic of our panel and of the conference in general, and I give the floor to Thomas Hio to lead us on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Barkan, for your comprehensive introduction to our panel. And I have the honor to say some words about our distinguished panelists. And perhaps ladies first. Dr. Monika Kareniauskaite is coming from Lithuania, and her research topics are Soviet and post-Soviet history, memory, law, gender and criminality. Her research and interests cover criminal prosecution systems in Soviet and post-Soviet Lithuania and the USSR, anti-Soviet resistance, Soviet political trials and deportations, the dissident movement and the culture of remembrance in the former Eastern Bloc, and the techniques of digital humanities. Dr. Kareniauskaite received her PhD in history at Vilnius University. She has been a research fellow at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, a project coordinator and research assistant at the memorial in Berlin-Hohenschönhausen, a leader of a research project of gender-based violence in 20th century Lithuania, a postdoctoral associate at Yale University, United States, and a visiting scholar at the Research Center for East European Studies of Bremen University in Germany. Currently, she is working at the Lithuanian Institute of History at Vilnius University, Institute of Law of the Lithuanian Center for Social Sciences, and she is a research fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Professor Vyacheslav Morozov is professor of EU-Russia Studies at the University of Tartu, Estonia, and academic director of the Center for Eurasian and Russian Studies of the University of Tartu. His research interests include post-colonial theory and critique, ideology and discourses in Russia, including comparative aspects, and the relations of European Union and Russia. He is a member of Academia Europaea, program chair of the annual Tartu Conference on Russian and East European Studies, country editor for USSR Russia in the Making Identity Count project, and member of the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia, Eurasia Academic Network. Vyacheslav Morozov is graduated as historian at the University of St. Petersburg, where he got also his PhD. He got his MA degree of the European Studies at the University of Limerick, Ireland. In 2009, he published a book, Russia and Others, Identity and Boundaries of a Political Community. Habilitated Dr. Michal Luchevsky. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Warsaw. He was Fulbright Scholar at Columbia University, a Josef Tischner Fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and a lecturer at the joint MA program of the Center for Social Studies in Warsaw and Lancaster University. In his research, he combines rigorous historical perspective with a fast geopolitical comparisons. Drawing on sociology, psychology, philosophy, history, theology, and the theory of systems, he analyzes the interface between religion and modernity. His first book, An Eternal Nation, How Catholics Became Poles, was awarded the Stefan Ossowski Prize. His latest book, Moral Capital, The Historical Politics in Late Modernity, addresses the question of emerging political and public religions in Poland, Germany, and Russia. And maybe we will have online participant also from Hungary. Dr. Gergely Pröle is director of Otto von Habsburg Foundation in Budapest. He lectured in foreign languages at Eötvös Loránd University, was the head of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Hungary, and became the state secretary in the Hungarian Ministry of Culture in 1998. From 2000 to 2005, he was Hungary's ambassador to Berlin and later Bern, Switzerland. Subsequently, he worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he was responsible for EU bilateral relations. Prior to his current position, he was the Director General of Petőfi Literary Museum in Budapest. Since 2006, he has been the lay president of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Hungary. And my name is Toomas Hiio. I am head of research of Estonian Institute of Historical Memory. The organizers have set us for discussion quite complicated questions, as sometimes happens. And our task is to discuss first multi-layered perceptions of European identity shaped by historical memory implications. Second, different approaches of remembrance policies and their agents fostering historical awareness in Europe, and thus reflecting on the following questions. A, is the post-war division into communist and capitalist blocs still relevant and resonating in different macro-regional remembrance cultures rooted in common historical experiences? And B, which role is the European Union playing now in creating a common identity in Europe? But now the floor is yours, distinguished panelists, and perhaps we begin with Professor Morozov.
Okay, thank you very much. As a matter of fact, I didn't expect to speak first, but no problem. Yes, indeed, it happens. I actually would like to address the second question that was set for this panel, which deals with the post-Cold War division into communist and capitalist, or post-communist and capitalist blocs, whether it's still relevant, does it resonate in different macro-regional remembrance cultures rooted in common historical experiences. And I should tell you right away that I don't have a yes or no answer to this question. Rather, I would like to invite everyone to reflect on what we mean by shared experiences. Many authors working in the post-colonial paradigm criticize what they call the worlding of the third world, arguing that this image of a separate world out there naturalizes Western superiority. However, even if that is true, it is also important that references to the third world or the developing countries, or maybe the global south today, it would be a more politically correct term, maybe, they still keep this region, these countries, these peoples, as a reference point in the debate on global justice. No one but maybe those on the extreme right will dare to dismiss the inequality between the North and the South as a non-issue today. The Second World, on the other hand, and on the contrary, has been unworlded after the end of communism. The countries of the former socialist bloc are basically just expected to merge into the global North. And the specificity of their historical experience is no longer even acknowledged, or at least not always acknowledged. The paradigm of post-communist transition presupposes that the former Second World is now no more than a backward part of the first one. This backwardness can be excused, of course, in the discourse of victimhood. And this is where memory politics starts to play a very important role. It's okay to be different if you can justify this by referring to the experience of communist oppression. However, there is also growing tension in this discourse of victimhood, a tension that is, I would say, domestic rather than international or macro-regional. There are large social groups that even today, 30 years after the end of communism, find themselves embedded in the legacies of Soviet or socialist industrialism and socialist modernity more generally. Regardless of the reasons for the persistence of these legacies, the life worlds of, let's say, a miner in Donbass or in Kohtla-Järve in Estonia, or a refinery worker in Belarusian Mozil are still defined by materialities that date back to the Soviet civilization, if we may call it this way. And they often feel insecure in today's world of urban culture, mobility, instability, unstable jobs, gig economy, and the like. They prefer a stable salary, welfare, and I personally wouldn't blame them for that. One could argue that in the first post-communist decades, many people valued national liberation more than past stability and welfare under an oppressive regime, and this is undoubtedly true. If a Russian miner in Kohtla-Järve, or Russian-speaking miner in Kohtla-Järve, might have been unhappy with the new order from the very beginning because they perceived it as different, not belonging to them, they would not feel represented in this order, then, let's say, a farmer in Pärnumaa, somewhere in Western Estonia, was ready to support what he would feel now was his country. But can we be sure that the current order still has the support of those farmers even today? Judging by the rise of various protest parties, especially on the right, on the right wing, on the extreme right, we might at least suspect that this order has lost its support, at least in large parts of the population. To draw on David Goodhart, maybe it's somewhat tired metaphor already, but still, our politics is increasingly framed by the opposition between anywheres and somewheres. It's the anywheres, the cosmopolitan middle class, who are in control, and not just of institutions, but also of discourses. And all that is left to somewheres is to resist, and to resist in a situation where sometimes they don't even have the ideological, ideational resources to base their resistance on. And this is what makes this resistance somewhat muted, and they just choose to vote for certain parties, or maybe they choose to be anti-vaxxers or in some other way to express their mistrust of the existing regime. So can we really have, coming back to the topic of this symposium, can we really have the same memory culture for all these diverse social groups? Is the emerging pan-European memory culture flexible enough, or maybe progressive enough, or maybe accommodating enough to account for the different wheres that are there, where those somewheres, those people that are connected with their existing environment where they live? What can the current European, presumably shared identity, offer to those who feel they have been left behind by the post-communist transition? Especially, of course, to those whose life worlds, as I already said, are still shaped by the material legacies of the Soviet industrialism, and who have nowhere to go from these Sovietized places. Can we really speak about a single European identity if for many people it symbolizes they're being, once again, they're being left behind? And of course, this opinion might be unfair, unjustified and all that, but can we really simply just dismiss it as misinformed, or maybe a product of some sort of disinformation or brainwashing or something like that? I'm not sure, because I guess we can no longer afford it, judging by the political consequences of such a dismissal. So these are the questions I'm struggling with myself, and I think that it's important to keep these questions on the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Morozov. And we are going now to our second panelist, and questions and also debate will follow after panelists' statements or presentations. And Dr. Lukasz, sorry, Ruszewski, please.
Thanks. Yeah, you called me Łukasz, and it's true that in Polish I'm also mistaken for Łukasz, because my surname is Łuczewski, whereas my name is Michael, and I see that it's maybe a globalizing trend. So thanks for reminding me of my name. Since yesterday I've been thinking what is between soljanka and sauerkraut soup, and why? I think this is a symbolic question, because I wanted to experience that city yesterday when I came here. So I went at night through the beautiful streets of Tallinn, and I went to a cheap restaurant, and I wanted to buy some local food. So first I picked up soljanka, but then it turned out that they don't have. And then I had to go for sauerkraut soup. And for me this is a symbolic thing, because maybe there is that difference between soljanka and sauerkraut. There's that distinction, there's that division, that divide. And then I'm wondering whether there is something else possible between those two choices. And let me frame it into more abstract terms. I think that place is, as we were told, symbolic, but also our hotel is symbolic. It's called Hestia Hotel Europe. So for me, you know, Europe is the representation of the West. And when you leave our hotel, then you are faced, and at least I was faced, with the Russian language. So I was immediately faced with the different face of Europe. And then again, is there a question for me, what's in between Europe, Hotel Europe, and Russia? And then I found out that in our hotel there's a small room in our dining hall called Central Europe. So I think this is the question of Central Europe. What is the specificity of that part of the world with regard to the West and to the East, with regard to soljanka and sauerkraut, to Russia and Europe. And by the way, there's also a Europe car there in the same hotel. So I was just amazed at the depth of that symbolism. Let me go one step further. In my research, I introduced the notion of moral capital. It means a set of stories that give our nations, our countries, a moral status. It can be a status of a victim, or it can be a status of a hero. And there are two main narratives, two main ways of building moral capital, of building moral status. One is, let's say, sauerkraut, a German one. It shows that we were perpetrators in the past, but now we have converted. This is a story of conversion. Now we show how democratic, liberal, open, progressive we are. And that's a story, actually kind of a very religious story of a new man who is built on the old man who was full of sins. And this is the story of conversion, where we picture ourselves as the inheritors of perpetrators. And then we side with the victims. I think that Professor from Columbia referred to that. On the other hand, there's a story that I call a story of ethos. And this is Solyanka story, Russian story. This is a story of survival of the character of a group, of an ethos of a group throughout time. Here, it's not as important whether we were good or bad. What is important that we have survived. And this is a Russian story. I'm basing that distinction on the comparison of museums in those two countries. And then the question is whether the third option is possible. What is between those two narratives? Whether Central Eastern Europe is just a non-existing place or just a small place, or is there any particular specific story and a specific way of acquiring moral capital? And my answer is yes. And I think that the problem in building European identity is that we oscillate between those two master stories, between Russian and German story. So either we claim that we were just heroes all the time and it doesn't matter whether we perpetrated any atrocities, or we claim that we were perpetrators all the time, and then it doesn't matter and then it matters that we have converted. And I call the third specific type for that part of the world, third type of a narrative, coming back to the sources, ressourcement. So we see the history, like Russians, as a source of strength. But we don't picture ourselves as perpetrators, unlike Germans, neither as heroes, like Russians. What we do, we see that there was, and let me refer to the notion that was brought up in your wonderful exhibition, traumas. So we are the place of traumas. We are the traumatic place. Timothy Snyder calls that part of the world bloodlands. And then, therefore, we come back to our story as a source of strength to give witness to our victims. And we are, in that place, victims. So there are three types of stories, and I think that our story is not understood well because it just doesn't fit to the West and it doesn't fit to the East. It's very hard to understand that we want to see ourselves as victims, and this is what in most, for example, in Poland, in most museums, you will see that type of a story. And let me finish with reference to what we've heard in the introduction. I think that Professor, you did not understand also the intention of that law that was passed in Poland. It was not against anybody. So that was not against the status of victims of other ethnicities, like specifically to Israeli community. It was not to diminish the importance of Holocaust, But the intention was first to show that Poles as a nation, as a state, were not responsible for the Holocaust. Because at the same time, Poles felt that we were victims of that atrocious regime. And I would agree that you know, the political execution of that was just unacceptable, that there was not enough contacts between Israelis and the US officials. So I will agree with that, but I would encourage you to think that that was a way of telling that story of coming back to the sources.
Thank you, Michal. And Professor Parkan, do you want to answer to Dr. Luszewski?
I think we have to hear, yes, I would very much like to answer it, but I think we should have our speakers finish, if you don't mind. I don't want to dominate. I would like to participate in the conversation in the follow-up.
Okay. Our first speaker is Monika Karenos-Kaite. Please, floor is yours.
Yes, hello, can you hear me? Seems it's fine. So my point is actually connected to very much what have been said already, but a little bit maybe broader, and I just want to think about this culture of memory and remembrance in Europe from the whole sort of civilization becoming different sort of becoming a civilization from the east and from the west of the continent. So I also would like to start maybe with a small joke or sort of impression I've gathered just recently. I was in a conference of Baltic studies in Sweden, and one Western professor actually, while presenting his views about developments in Latvia, he used the term post-Soviet to the contemporary Latvian perspectives. And I was really curious why this term post-Soviet is still used without really trying to question what it really means, what is the content of this term, of this definition. And the answer was very simple, because Latvia is still post-Soviet, because Latvia still have problems with Russian minorities, which dates back to the Soviet Union. And then, of course, the joke is that I started to think, well, in Lithuania we still have problems with Polish minority. For instance, Polish minority in Lithuania is still not allowed to use the Polish alphabet and characters. And, well, does it mean that Lithuania still is living in the post-interwar phase or what? But that's, of course, more of a joke. But what I'm trying to say here, that past always leaves actually traces visible in the present, and those collapse of previous empires in Europe still has some sort of trace in our mentality, in the ways we shape our realities. We think about the future, we think about the present and the past. And so is, of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, if you want to call it like this, or with the buffer zone of the Soviet state, it's Eastern Europe. So it's very natural that Cold War heritage is still shaping our cultures of memory and identity. And there are certain fields where is still this division visible. I will just mention a couple of those, maybe, or three, if I have time. So the Holocaust remembrance, of course, is very, very obviously easy to detect. And this also is connected, of course, with the Eastern European during the Cold War, their way of Holocaust remembrance, which was of course very much connected to Russian narrative and Russian story, or Soviet story if you want, not maybe only Russian, about the Second World War, this heroic story more than the really understanding the deepness of the Holocaust. So no surprise that, for instance, still in many countries, from Eastern Germany to my own country, Lithuania, we see problems and we see gaps in the Holocaust education. and so on. And of course, nationalism, extremism, these views persist, which is directly connected to that. And then the resistance against both Soviet and Nazi dictatorships is something where I would say still division continues between East and West part of Europe, which was just mentioned here in this debate too, these different perceptions and different understandings. One more thing, what can be said here is that still in the societies like my own, sometimes it's very difficult to accept the idea that if someone was resisting Soviets, at the same time, the same person could be maybe potentially a perpetrator or a collaborator with the Nazi regime. Because it just seems impossible. We were victims. We were victims of both totalitarian regimes. And how could this be, right? So still, I think there are more and more awareness about this, but still some sort of taboo culture sometimes still prevailing here, persisting here. Yes. So, and the third misunderstanding, maybe, or misconception how the West sees the East is that for instance, platform of European Memory and Conscience stressed in their analysis about the House of European History Museum that, West sees the East as someone who basically chose state socialist or communist systems, but not the ones that were forced to those systems, that it was not sort of welfare state model that Eastern Europe suddenly chose, but it was all done under military, some sort of threats and occupations even in the Baltic case. Not a free election choice and so on. So these are probably those misconceptions I wanted to express here. Yes, the German sort of remembrance model was already mentioned here. What is still maybe important is to say that during this communist or Soviet time, there were maybe two ideas, both in the West and East, and those ideas prevailed in the 90s that I would call it as an optimism of final liberalization, democratization, and free market all over the world. Western view and the Eastern view, the idea that we are coming home finally to the West, to the same civilization, and that we must be accepted in the West. But these both were, of course, more ideal types than the realities in the both East and West side of Europe. So first of all, here we can trace back more deeper in history and think about, do Eastern Europe really need to come back home, and how does mechanism of European integration or Western integration happened here throughout the ages? And here we see different stories, very different dates of, for instance, Christianization, like for instance, Franks were Christianized in 5th, 6th century, and my own country, for instance, only in the 14th century. So very different ways of how different more distant parts of Europe in the West or North took or internalized both Western invented technologies and social norms, like, for instance, some technologies of the warfare in Grand Duchy of Lithuania was very late if you compare it to the Western European technologies and so on. And yes, this had sometimes even positive outcomes, because some toxic, bad, immoral models of the West were not fully integrated into the East. For instance, medieval or late or early modern anti-Semitism was less sometimes in some cases in the Eastern Europe than in the Western Europe at the time. Here I'm also mentioning the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, for instance. But sometimes, of course, it had a very, very negative outcome. So all the time trying of the Eastern Europe to somehow catch up. Maybe that's not the case of all Eastern European countries. Maybe Poland has different story, or Hungary different story, that were more like deeper civilizations. But with my own country, that's really true. And well, the post-Second World War, Cold War narrative, then coming back home. And well, here is the problem. I would say that both narratives were sort of fake or idealistic narratives, like some of the Western countries. Yes, they supported Eastern European integration process, but at the same time were full of still stereotypes and saw Eastern Europe as somewhat anthropological other, and that's all maybe what Brexit could be about and many other processes. And at the same time, Eastern Europe, they came back to the West and they noticed that the West is not the same West in their fantasies, in their ideas of the West. And if you want, I could here re-quote Marshall McLuhan, that Eastern Europe, when they look into the West, they sort of look into the rear view mirror and try to see the West, or imagine the West which is not existing anymore, at the same time mimicking it or trying to internalize it, but not always successfully. And I think the other problem is this Eastern European throughout the history, some sort of lack of self-esteem, lack of believing that they are able to construct their own innovations in everything, academic perspective or technological perspective. And there is no need to catch up anymore, because the world has changed, the West has changed. The West also shows some tendencies that democracy can erode even in the very, very old democratic countries and traditions. So that's probably the problem. And well, we can think about the solution and how to finally understand each other and find common perspectives, common ground for these debates. So well, I think, first of all, before finding those solutions, it's very important to identify, we know a lot about history, but we probably not know yet enough about the current state of development, both social and technological development. So to be more and more aware how technologies actually shape our reality, how they shape our views in history, and how they shape the polarization and divisions. With just very current example about Facebook and its ways of actually causing conflict because it's beneficial to the platform instead of really building that real democracy. So probably digital literacy could be the solution, but of course, again, tracing back to this common heritage of the European idea, European values such as human rights, rule of law, unity in diversity, if you want, and of course, thinking more about the Western concept as individualism, as privacy. What do they mean to us? Those, for instance, rights were also violated by authoritarian regimes, but we don't discuss that much about it, like a violation of individual privacy, private life, done by state surveillance, that it's again emerging as a threat in the digital era. And of course, all these digital security issues, cybersecurity issues, and so on. So maybe the solution could be to debate a little bit if we can have a new green course, but also not only in the technologies, the greener technologies, but also helping technologies to shape our societies in more pro-democratic pro-human rights way to create some sort of platforms for the real democracy, for finally meeting each other and really debating, accepting each other with our maybe wounds, maybe traumas, maybe different ideas about the past, but looking to the future, how we can build this common ground. So maybe what I can now finish this speech is, well, we can look also at successful examples, such as, for instance, a digital example, the Europeana database, which I think is one of those ways how we build our common heritage, and if we could extend this to our parts of our history, our debates, and our communities, that would be just very beneficial. So that's it for now.
Thank you, Monica. Do we have Mr. Pröla somewhere in the web? Not yet. So I would like to add only some moments here, because we have heard very, I would say, very different approaches to our topic. And I would like to add here only some things what were made on European level. I am not an European official, I am not even Estonian official, but anyway, it is worth of noting. So the common European history was discussed already during the Cold War in European Union and its predecessors, but after enlargement of European Union, it began again, I would say, and the problem was that Eastern European countries were afraid that their communist past will not be taken into account in such amount that they would like it. And then the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe in January 2006 made a resolution on the need for international condemnation of crimes of totalitarian communist regimes. Then European Parliament in 2009 followed with a resolution on European conscience and totalitarianism. And the last one I have to mention here, of course, there is about 10 or more international documents on different level adopted. The last one is European Parliament resolution from September 2019 on the importance of European remembrance for the future of Europe. So we know that Europe is a union of very different countries with very different histories of nations, states, and empires. And we are what were our predecessors, and therefore already the history has to be taken into account in every act what we are doing. And I hope European Union, as also other European institutions, are very much aware of it. But now, Professor Barkan, I would like to give the floor over to you.
Thank you. I think a lot of interesting things were said, but let me just comment on the three narratives. And I think the main difficulty is that the West does not recognize the authoritarian oppression, the dictatorship, the Soviet dictatorship as equal being merit. And as a result of that, the defensive mechanism of Central and Eastern Europe is to divide perpetrators from victims, to decide that either they can be perpetrators or they can be victims, not both. I think that down the road, the West will have to learn to evaluate and to commemorate and to empathize with the suffering under Soviet oppression, but at the same time, Central Eastern European countries have to recognize that some of their population participated in the Holocaust. It's not the Poles, as all the Poles are included. Even we have stories even of some people that were both righteous and safe victims and perpetrators in another part of the war. So I think there is a challenge to both sides, the recognition that remembrance is a core value, is accepted in both parts of Europe. But what we need is, we need to be able to recognize the suffering of all, and also that every country has perpetrators among its population. This does not exclude anybody. And Israel is going through this very much on its own in recognizing that you can't leverage the victimization to victimize someone else. I think that victimization is cause of human rights remembrance, and this has to be a dual narrative and a dual effort. It's not to put Polish or other Eastern European countries as guilty. France can, not just Germany, France has accepted and apologized for Vichy France. That doesn't mean to say they were not victims. So I hope that the efforts that we all do will open up the conversation more, and it won't be either judo comuna or victims. The choice is not one or the other. The choice is to bridge the two narratives together. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barkan. And do we have Mr. Pröhle? No, but it is sort of improvisation of such hybrid panels. But anyway, now we are going further and began with debate between our panelists. And I would like to begin with the questions that, of course, remembrance is an important part of common history. And remembrance of victims, I would say, is one of the main topics of the common European documents I have named. And but we know that sufferings, they are going into the past. Victims and survivors going also into the past, and only something is remaining. And perhaps could you say which is the influence in different various European countries, influence and importance of the past concentrating to the victims and survival? Mr. Professor Morozov, please, begin with you.
Could you repeat the question, please? I mean, the question itself.
What is the connection in our national or European history in general and with our history of sufferings, victims, and would say also perpetrators or heroes? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think I would emphasize that connections can be multiple, and remembrance is a pluralist notion, and in that sense, I think it's very important to appreciate the fact that different historical experiences in different parts of Europe, West and East, North and South, bring about rather different memory cultures, but there's also, in addition to the geographical dimension, there's definitely a social dimension, depending on family histories, on family backgrounds, on sort of family trajectories. People remember pasts differently, and in that sense, the connection between the victims of the past and the remembrance of the present is not necessarily straightforward. And I also think that in many cases, people might feel alienated from the established regime of memory because they don't feel it applies to them, because they feel they might be the victims today, and no one actually cares about that. And that's, I think, the biggest problem for the current current memory culture that kind of dominates in Europe. And also, one thing that worries me a little bit about the current situation, which is actually not very current any longer, I mean, it's sort of post-Cold War in general, is what I sometimes call the Copenhagen moment. It refers to the Copenhagen criteria, of course, the criteria that were introduced by the then still actually European communities when they were preparing for the enlargement of the European Union that was about to be established, and then sort of promoted as a set of criteria for East Europeans to join the European Union, to join the West, to come home, as it was pointed out in a number of presentations today. That was, I think, a moment when the emerging European Union switched from one model of remembrance to another mode of remembrance. The original model was, of course, never again, and that concerned, in the first place, the Holocaust, but also, of course, in as much as it was relevant, but of course for the European communities at the moment of their emergence, the Holocaust was much more central than whatever happened in the communist world. But with this Copenhagen moment, what actually happened was what Thomas Christiansen described as Europe perceiving itself as a finalité politique, Europe perceiving itself as an accomplished project, as something that is already there, that no longer requires any struggle, any overcoming. The European Union reconceptualized itself as something that has been already achieved. European democracy started to be perceived as something that is already there. It still requires a little bit of work here and there, of course, but we are still the model. Look at those East Europeans, they're striving so hard to come in, which means that we're worth something, and we're not just worth something, but we are also the model for the East and also maybe for the entire world. I think it's very dangerous. This complacency which is implicit in this discourse might be very dangerous. And it also, once again, coming back to where I started, it might actually undermine the pluralist understanding of remembrance. And it might actually lead to certain specific models to be presented as the only ones possible, ignoring the multiplicity of memories and histories and experiences that actually constitute the European experience, the European history as such, I would say. And once again, coming back to where to my initial intervention, I would say that we do, I think, see signs of tension in this narrative, in this idea that Europe is a fait accompli, is an established polity, a finalité politique, and there are symptoms of unhappiness in large segments of European societies with this feeling of accomplishment that is so much evident in the current situation. So let me stop here, and I see that we probably have the fourth panelist joining us finally.
Dr. Gergely Prööle has joined us, and Dr. Prööle, I have already introduced you for the audience, and now we can go directly to your short presentation or statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the technical problems. Is that clear with voice and picture probably? So is it okay? So can you hear me and can you see me? Thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the kind invitation. We in Hungary, we are in the nowadays European discussion in a very special position, because historical roots, national identity are of course very important for the Hungarian government nowadays, and I think although that it's very important to say it very clearly that it is not necessarily an orientation to the past. In the contrary, it should be very much linked to the modernity. And I think nowadays modern Hungary and modern Europe has the task to develop a kind of knowledge, a kind of technique, how to link tradition, national identity, and the consciousness about it with the idea of modern Europe. I'm working for the Otto von Habsburg Foundation, which has the task to deal with the heritage and with the archive of Otto von Habsburg. And because of that, I'm very strongly involved in all the discussions which took place before establishing the European cooperation and the European unity. And because of that, I think it's very important nowadays to say that the European idea and the idea of nation states, they are not in the opposite. It can be make sure that that they exist parallelly, and we have to make sure that the European idea and the European tradition can be linked with the existence of the nation states. I would like to go back a little bit in the history and to speak about the Christian roots of Europe and of a very special aspect of the Christian roots, especially the Reformation. I mean, the Reformation in Europe more than 500 years ago was a very important and a crucial point in European history, because that was the point when, through the establishing and the introduction of the Bible, that was possible to develop the languages of the different nations, and through the Bible and through the development of the national languages, that was possible to understand more the universal character of Christianism, and to understand more the message of the Christianity. I think we have to go back to these ideas, and to make it more conscious nowadays how important they are. But if we speak about European identity nowadays, of course we speak about that this Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, but the other important aspect is the Enlightenment. And I'm convinced that this very sensitive balance between the Judeo-Christian traditions and the Enlightenment, the values of the Enlightenment, that can bring us to that cooperation, to that consensus, which is able to maintain the European idea, to bring us to that modernity with the consciousness about the importance of traditions. And only that way could we have the ambition to develop these common values which can bring us together. Probably one other aspect which is always said, but in the practice is sometimes not so easy, this so-called motto of the European Union, united in diversity. How much diversity are we ready to expect, and how much union are we ready to achieve? I think the most important thing in the European discourse is to listen to each other, to be able to accept each other's tradition. And due to the fact that I used to be diplomat in Switzerland, I am convinced that we should be able to overcome these differences, and with practical solutions, with practical ideas which can link the different nations to each other, like in Switzerland, we are able to establish this well-functioning European system on the basis on these values. I repeat, the Judeo-Christian tradition and the values of enlightenment. And one last sentence. The most important is nowadays to overcome this situation what we see every day through the communication, which became much faster than before. We are necessarily always on the track of simplification, and simplification is always the most dangerous thing in the European communication. So to speak out about our tradition, our identity, with that ambition of consensus on the Christian and the values of the Enlightenment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pröhle. And we continue with our interventions of members of the panel. Please, Michal.
Many thoughts. First, I would like to come back to Professor Barkan. I think that actually what you have done is the work of enlightenment, or actually Bildung, as the Germans say, that we don't have to take those positions like the position of victim, the status of hero, or the status of perpetrator, because in reality it's just much more complex. You know, it's not so simple in the words of the previous panelist. So for example, perpetrators can become perpetrators because they were victimized, because they saw that they can kill somebody without any consequences. And in psychology, this is called perpetrators introject. When we see and when we are victimized, then the part of a perpetrator enters our inner system, and then we can also victimize other people the same way. So that's a paradox. Or we can become a perpetrators because we wanted to be a hero. Why? For example, during the Holocaust, you could host some Jewish men into your house out of your open heart. But then it turned out that the village is turning against you because you became a danger to the village. And then you might be forced, and no matter how tragically it sounds, to expel or even kill somebody whom you hosted first. So what I saw in your words is that in reality we are changing all the time those positions, those statuses. But on the other hand, the politics of history is a very simplistic domain, and there is no much place for the Enlightenment, no much place for Bildung. So we, as states, and we can look at states as moral agents, we tend to take those simple positions. And our politicians represent those simple positions, and this is why we need such initiatives like our initiative. You can look at it from what I call global dramatic triangle of memories. So with regard to the Holocaust, you'll have perpetrators, and that simple position is taken by the Germans. Then you have heroes, those who saved Europe, on the one hand Russians, and on the other hand Americans. And then you have victims, and that place is taken by the Israelis. But I think that now that dramatic triangle that is very, I would say, stable, is changing. When you look at, for example, Black Lives Matter movement, Americans and America as such is taking the position of a perpetrator, not as a hero. When you think about expulsions, and it was mentioned already in Germany, then there's a trend to take the position of victims. And then you can think about Israel as heroes, as a startup nation. So then you have another triangle that is very, very compact. And those triangles are everywhere. In our families, there will be a victim, a perpetrator, and a hero. And we can change all those positions. So what I want to show is that we have to move beyond those positions and those simple statuses to understand and to interact with one another. And one second thought, and maybe one more comment to that. I think that what we witness now in the world is the diminishing of the Holocaust as a most important point of reference. And I think that it was clearly seen in the Black Lives Matter movement, that now the master story of global morality is the story of slaves and expulsions. And this is also the story that is represented by Germany. And that's, I just want to offer you as a hypothesis that the Holocaust and its role will be diminished. For example, there were no nobody from BLM movement would compare their movement to the Holocaust. It was rather the other way around. So that's I think, a massive change in our moral scape. And then the question about coming back to Judeo-Christian roots of Europe, you can look at it from my perspective, so moral stories. You can overcome Christianity, and that would be the story, sauerkraut story. So we overcome the past. We are more Christian than the Christians before us. So, everybody can almost, on Twitter feel as better than, the Christian saints from the past. So that's a one way of approaching Christianity. I would say this is the Western part, the Western type of approaching Christianity. We want to overcome the past. The Eastern type, so the Soljanka type, would be the type that we want to keep Christianity as it is. So we want to, whether it was good or bad, it doesn't matter. We want to preserve the form of Christianity. So we want to preserve that power that is behind Christianity. And the Central Eastern European part would be, in my estimation, represented, for example, by Arvo Pärt, who is renewing Christianity. So he's coming back to the sources of Christianity with something new. So he's not overcoming Christianity, he's not keeping the form of Christianity, but he's renewing Christianity. And this is the third type of a moral story that can be represented by music. Wonderful, probably one of the most wonderful music you can think in the 20th and 21st century.
Thank you, Michal. And Monica, your thoughts, please.
Yes, thank you. So just a couple of remarks here. I agree that reality between being victim and perpetrator is way more complex sometimes than those black and white poles and opposites, but there is one more thing. If we think about the categories of law, then there is actually still remains a need to say what was the crime, who was the victim, and who was the perpetrator. And I think here the problem with this unclarity is the problem of the lack of transitional justice in the, let's say, pan-national level or European level, if you want, that really this process of coming into legal terms with previous perpetrators of undemocratic regimes and authoritarian regimes has not been successfully accomplished in many cases, and that's why there is now this still sort of unclarity. But I as historian, I understand and I agree with this very complex reality. But if you think from the perspective of victim, yes, there is harm that victim experienced, and that harm somehow needs the way to bring the perpetrator to the justice. Another thing, yes, those laws exist. In many countries they exist, but for example, in Lithuania, this implementation of the law is still not in all cases easy, successful, and needs more of the political will, which is sometimes very controversial position to take and not easy position to take. Well, and traumas, of course, is a good material for right-wing, extreme right-wing, populist politicians, and that's why I think in addition to those technological algorithms that increase polarization, there is also this sort of political demand to increase that polarization, that those regimes could actually feed themselves on those traumas or wounds, if you want. But also, I think what is important to say that I agree with the idea that more and more awareness about the other victim groups is coming into our global or European culture of remembrance, and I see it as more positive process, maybe because really in some cases those categories of victims, they exceed the ethnic and national categories. And well, if we, for instance, think about communist or state socialist times or Soviet times, most of those countries really had legislation criminalizing gay people, for instance. So this is clearly another victim of the group, which is sort of included in some remembrance cultures, but not that strongly. I know Estonia is doing something about it, but not every country really has this perspective. Or yes, we were talking about slave rights to be remembered and this sort of reconciliation, but we also see a lot of violence against women, which also, even sometimes, those mechanisms of suppression really exceed the East and West polarization, and we see it in the both sides of Europe or globe and so on. So I agree with claims for more understanding and complexity, who the victim, who the perpetrator is, and that these roles in psychology really sometimes overlapped. But also I see some kind of thread here to go into some moral relativism and legal relativism, and not really to understand. And I think I still support the idea that, yes, in some cases, the legal justice is maybe not possible to achieve like fully. For instance, not enough data, everyone has died, not enough evidences, and so on. But at least then historical justice, we have to finish that task. We really have to see who were victims, collect their names, their stories fully. In most of the cases it's done, but not everywhere. We need to really name the perpetrators, even if they were victims in some other context, but very clearly name them as perpetrators. And that's I think, the challenge that some maybe countries are still facing, still trying to deal with. But I think without knowing facts and putting those facts into publicity and broader discourse of remembrance and knowing what was what, we cannot really move forward with the process of reconciliation. And yes, there is this academic side of things, but I think this is also, there is this human rights and legal justice side of things, and both somehow to if we really find a way to both perspectives, how they can talk to each other, both perspectives, then maybe there we can find some solution, how to find, again, the common discourse, common vocabulary, common understanding, common ethnic and ethic ways to really resolve those divisions.
Thank you, Monica. And there are no panel discussion without audience. And therefore also audience has a right to ask questions and not so much right to make longer statements. But I give the word now to Professor Barkan for his intervention, if he likes, and also Professor Barkan will lead the questions and answers part. But I'm saying here, being here, I'm saying that when you will ask a question, please say your name. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment. I agree completely that the issues are more complex, and as such, there are different narratives, and the memory laws cannot dominate the discussion. The second point I want to make very short is that memory brings more memory, not less memory. So I would say that you are absolutely right in pointing to other forms of victimization, but that does not withdraw from the memory of the Holocaust or of the Soviet oppression. There is much more that it brings together. Multidirectional memory by Rosberg is a very useful concept for that. But I'll now move to the audience. I can't see the audience, so that may be a technical...
Okay. A question, please. I can see the audience, more or less. Please raise your hand when you want to ask something. Everything seems to be clear already, or not yet. But then we have the opportunity to give a word for second intervention to Professor Dr. Pröhle, because he came a little bit late and he missed the first round of intervention. So, Professor Pröhle, Dr. Pröhle, if you would like to add something according to our discussion, please.
I mean, it's not very easy to say something, because my text was totally out of the blue compared to your discussion. But I've tried to follow that before, and so no doubt it's a very interesting problem. But I try to link my points to the topic of your discussions. And I think what is in the whole remembrance issue the most important, that we have to have a common value base to discuss all these very crucial and sensitive issues in an open manner. So we have to have a lack of consensus about some different about the methodical issues and about the manner how we discuss that with each other. So what you have mentioned before, this the values of enlightenment, the Bildung. What is the result of this common Bildung? Are we able to go back to these basic values of Christianity and enlightenment, and to speak about our differences on that basis? Because I think all these tragical historical developments happened when the political decision maker, the leaders in Europe or wherever in the world has forgotten about this common value. So no enlightenment and no Judeo-Christian basis. So my point is that we should again and again emphasize this common ground, and to make it clear that we should organize our discussions and to build up our own positions on that basis, and then we have a much bigger chance to come to a common understanding.
Thank you, Dr. Pröhle. And yes, we have a question. Please.
Yes, thank you, Florian Abraham. Florian Abraham is my name. I have a question for Michal. You discuss about the concept moral capital instead of social capital. You described a competing situation between slavery trauma and genocide trauma. But where is the anti-communism trauma on this competing situation? Remain just a regional trauma or have the power to remain a global trauma?
Oh, that's such a profound question. I think that, of course, there is that globalizing trend to universalize the trauma of the communist era, and it is encapsulated in the image of Gulag. So on the one hand, we have Holocaust, on the other hand, we have Gulag. But I think still this is a regional trauma. And I think this is a challenge that all those small or bigger nations from that part of the Europe face. How we translate our regional traumas into a universal language. And you know, we speak in English, everybody now, so we have to even use different languages. Even we use German, yeah? So I introduced, you know, a German word, but we are not using our own words. And I would say, why is that? Because we want to universalize our own experience, and it precludes using our own language. So we have to distance from our experience to universalize our experience. I was thinking about also, you know, what resonated with me in the old square of Tallinn. And I know that it was renovated, it was rebuilt after the Second World War, but everybody, I just saw it in touristic leaflets that this is on World Heritage UNESCO list. And it resonated with me because also the old square of Warsaw is on World Heritage UNESCO list. And when I met some friends from the US, they were just laughing at me. Micha, why are you so proud that this is, you know, World Heritage UNESCO list? And I thought to myself, well, they don't have to aspire to be on the, you know, World Heritage list because they created heritage list. Or France is a heritage UNESCO site. So there's that trend to universalize our experience, but I think that it will be still regional, and this is why we need such fora as that and interactions between us to move just one step forward. And of course, you know, I was thinking about what does it mean, the communist trauma. And I was thinking about my family, and you know, it's a trauma of poverty, it's a trauma, like in Estonia, of expulsions, to a lesser extent in Poland. It's a trauma of massive emigration, like in Estonia, maybe to a lesser degree in Poland. There's a trauma of abortion. That's a trauma then of transformation that we had to leave that known world. So I think that that even under that simple term, you know, communist trauma, there are so many traumas that run through our families that it's even hard for us in our countries to give justice to what happened to us.
I would like to add you to the list of traumas, also the trauma of certain loss of pride. Do we have more questions from audience now?
Perhaps I will just interrupt you for a moment to respond to Ambassador Pole. When we remember the Judeo-Christian heritage of Europe, we also have to remember that Eastern Europe homogeneity is a very recent thing. At the end of World War I, there were over 30% minorities in each country in Eastern Europe. And it's only more recently that minorities become a challenge to European identity. And it is not a place of strength. I think that we need, if we want to go back to the Enlightenment and to the beginning of the 20th century, we should remember the plurality as a major point of strength.
Thank you. I cannot see more questions. So my task is now, or has somebody from the panel to say something more? No. Then is my then my task is to somehow conclude our discussion, and coming back to the task set up for us for this panel. We have got quite comprehensive picture of how multi-layered the perceptions of European identity are amongst scholars, as also among the citizens of various European countries. Coming to post-war division into communist and capitalist blocs, we can say that it is still vivid. We are not thinking together towards our histories like one European nation, and it is normal, it should be so. And the last question, in which role the European Union playing now in creating a common identity in Europe, we could see that this role is existing, but this role of European Union is depending on citizens of Europe and also on the national identities and national histories of European countries, members of the European Union. And last but not least, when we are speaking about Europe, we cannot forget that Europe is not only European Union. I'm wondering why British did not left Europe with their language. And I would like to thank you, all participants of the panel, especially Professor Barkan from United States and Dr. Pröhle from Hungary. It is not easy to be part of a discussion that takes place thousands of kilometers away. And as I have said already, there is no discussion without audience. I have to thank you also for your patience and attention. Have a nice day. Thank you.
I will introduce every speaker. Every speaker will have like a maximum 90 seconds to present his institution or his project. I would like those present here on the venue to come here and to present it. Whoever will have the presentation, it will be screened just on the screen. If we have somebody online, then we just have the recordings and it will be screened also in alphabetic order together with everybody. If you happen to exceed 90 seconds, I will just ring the bell. So please, let's start with Martin Andreler from Estonian Institute of Historical Memory.
For the past 4 years, we have been working on the project Patarei 2026. Yes. What does that mean? In year 2026, we should be opening a brand new museum here in Tallinn. It will be located in the former Patarei prison, place which was one of the most feared Soviet dungeons of its time in Estonia. When you ended up in Patarei and you weren't working there, it was quite clear that you can exit that place only going to the Gulag labor camp or in front of the executioner. Why we? Our institute and my colleagues have been working in the field of recent history, doing research about crimes against humanity, etc., for the past decades. Today, we are working on the oral history portal called Kogume Lugu. We are the keepers of the database called e-memorial. You will have the visit to the physical memorial tomorrow. Memorial dedicated to the victims of communism, just across the bay from Patarei, and just as a bridge between the history, commemoration, and ourselves. We are constructing a database of articles and information about communism, different communist regimes, and dictatorship in the world, etc. We are doing research and cooperation with our colleagues from all over the world, and many of you from this room. But the International Museum, you might ask, why? Isn't there enough of the topic already in the world? Well, the answer is no. Nobody can speak better about our past or our story than we ourselves. But in terms of telling our story, we also have to tell your history and your stories as much as we can to give the wider perspective to the visitor. We have to give voice to those who perished due to the repressions and don't have the ability to speak for themselves. Nobody wants to be forgotten. So let them live as a warning from the past, so those atrocities will never happen again. We owe them that. Thank you. It doesn't work.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, you can hear me. Now, Mrs. Terje Anepayo, the Estonian National Museum.
Dear participants of the symposium, the Estonian National Museum is the largest museum and one of the most important depositories of national heritage in Estonia. The presentation introduces the current audiovisual fieldwork project of the Estonian National Museum among predominantly Russian-speaking former miners in northeastern Estonia. For this project, the museum is cooperating with the NGO Estonian Oil Shale Seniors. Our goal is to capture the life histories and events that preserve the identity and memory of the local Russian-speaking community. The pandemic has disrupted and slowed down our fieldwork, but for now we have recorded over 25 hours of material. Let's see some clips.
Снег тает, а обуви нет резиновой, чтобы я сходил. Я валенки одеваю, из дома выхожу. Вышел на улицу, валенки снял, и бегом я пробежал до школы. 4 пушки было, 1 дальномер, прибор. На приборе работало 10 человек, тоже девушки. А на пушках ребята работали.
А потом, значит, когда нас хотели увезти в Германию в 1943 году, довезли нас до станции починок и освободили Красное. В то время, конечно, после войны плохо жили. Ну что делаешь?
The next one is Professor Grzegorz Berend from Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk. Sorry, it was my mistake. I missed one person, the third one. sorry. It's just Mrs. Maria Axinte from PTSD Prison Memorial.
Hello everyone, this is Maria from Romania. I am the director and founder of Pitești Prison Memorial, which is a memorial located inside a former political prison in communist Romania. We are proposing this very new project that we are embarking on at the moment, which is called Museum of Communism for Children. The aim of the project is to educate and inform the younger generation on the communist system, the consequences of dictatorship, but also on the functioning of this system, of the communist system in Romania, and not only. The project will comprise of an exhibition, which will be an interactive exhibition. It will also have a digital manual dedicated to students and teachers alike. They can use it at school as well. A workbook where children can take notes, they can conduct interviews and write down whatever they feel about what they see in the exhibition or the information they receive. They can also use it as a journal as well. There will be workshops and also guided tours throughout the exhibition. The aim is not only to educate the young generation, but actually make them get involved, get their feedback, and have them as co-curators of this exhibition and of the information that young children receive on communism. I hope you can all be interested in the project, and we really hope for more partners around Europe, because we would like for this project to become multiplied in museums around Europe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now Professor Grzegorz Berend from the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we run the main museum with a narrative of fate of civilians during the Second World War. But our second most important task now is creation of a new narrative museum at the peninsula of Westerplatte, place of the first battle of the Second World War. 2 years ago, we found remnants of Polish soldiers who were defending the Polish depot for 7 days. And only after 80 years we were able to find them, and we know the names of at least 8 of these soldiers, and we are to organize a formal traditional funeral at new military cemetery at Westerplatte and open a new exhibition of archaeological objects found during excavation during last 5 years. We hope to open a new branch of our museum at Westerplatte in 5 years to make a new interesting place for historical education and social interaction. Please find yourself welcome to Gdańsk and to Westerplatte. Come to Gdańsk to visit us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Murray Bessett, Common Sense Society.
Thank you. The American dream, liberty, prosperity, and beauty for all, is a common sense society curricular toolbox consisting of a growing number of modules that support teachers in exploring the value of Western civilization through a comparative examination of the histories and principles of our systems of liberty and their totalitarian counterparts. Each module contains a selection of primary resources, student assignments, and classroom activities designed to enable students to examine the nature and preconditions of liberty, prosperity, beauty, and the pursuit of happiness, to consider how and to what extent these principles have been implemented in the course of history, and to compare and contrast this history of implementation with that of the putative alternatives, past, present, and future. The first module, Building Free Government, A Tale of Two Constitutional Systems, includes 2 lesson plans. The Promise of Rights allows students to compare the kinds of rights promised in the American Constitution and its Soviet counterparts, and to contrast the adherence of the governments established by each. Governmental structure and powers enables students to understand how the structure of government is essential to the protection of rights, and how the tyranny of the Soviet state was the inevitable outcome of its governing documents. Taken together, the module explains how important the structure of government is to realizing the promise of a written constitution that is vital to free and democratic governance throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now Paolo Ceccoli from Euroclio.
I have no presentation because it was beyond my capability to summarize Euroclio activities in 90 seconds. But our activity, I don't know how much you are familiar with, is to foster history education. And I think that history education is one of the possibilities to foster also European identity. For what is concerned history education, we are an organization trying to build up bottom-up projects. And the project I want to mention to you is the last one we are running with the Institute of History, Justice and Reconciliation, which is called Contested Histories. And I think it's very important because it tries to make a didactical perspective of the monuments and cancelled culture questions. And I hope you will visit the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite Alexander Formozov from Transition Dialogue.
I hope this works. Yeah. Alexander Formozov, coordinator in civic education at DRA, an NGO in Berlin. And I would like to draw your attention to transition after '89, which was, of course, a huge journey for hundreds of millions of people to a new world, to a new future. And of course, there are many stories, voices, there are discrepancies, but also some common perceptions on transition. And we in the network, Transition Dialogue, network of experts, practitioners, and in history and civic education, we think that it's very important to speak about this for the future of Europe. This is a network working now in 8 countries, and we focus on the formation of knowledge and on perceptions of transition post-'89, especially in public discourse and in teaching. The main objectives, as you can see, are to bridge European perceptions on these transitions, to incorporate multi-perspectivity and an international approach, and to create new formats and methods, especially for teaching. At the level of education, we have analyzed and mapped the education on transition in different countries, identified important issues, and the handbook, How to Teach Transition, is coming soon. On the level of public discourse, we worked in a variety of different formats, also digital, and you can visit and see some of them on our website. Here is the contact, and you're very welcome to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have the Václav Havel Library online.
A myšlenkový, politický a literární odkaz Václava Havla a šířit jej dál, seznamovat s ním také ostatní. A za tímto účelem je dokumentačním střediskem, výzkumným střediskem, je publikačním střediskem a organizuje celou řadu akcí.
Thank you. And now, as well online, we have Łukasz Jasiński from the Center for Historical Research in Berlin of the Polish Academy of Science.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am very happy and pleased that I have an opportunity of presenting my scientific project. My goal is to conduct a comparative, transnational and interdisciplinary study on roundtable negotiations from the Fall of Nations in 1989. The roundtable talks took place in various European countries at that time: Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and even outside Europe in Mongolia. The mechanism of roundtable negotiations is also present in contemporary politics. Just to mention the example of two roundtable negotiations in Ukraine, which shattered, and in Tunisia during the revolution of 2011. Therefore, I intend to conduct an interdisciplinary transnational analysis of roundtable mechanism. The role of negotiations and compromise in politics seems to be of big importance, especially today, as we are living in the times of growing political and social tensions and polarization. Currently, at the Center of Historical Research, the Polish Academy of Science in Berlin, we are looking for possibilities of grant applications and future cooperation. So, should you have any questions or are willing to cooperate, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you so much for your attention. Very happy and pleased that I have an
Thank you. Okay, now as well online we have Magdalena Krajewska from Institute of National Remembrance in Poland.
Good morning. I would like to present some basic information on the use of the CODIS program in the identification of victims of totalitarianism carried out by the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland. Well, how CODIS works and what it is the world's best relationship analysis software, which is not available for scientific and commercial laboratories. The system does not collect personal, like sensitive data, and it works in 58 countries around the world, including Poland. Licenses in Poland are held by two institutions, Institute of National Remembrance and Central Forensic Laboratory of the Police. What CODIS include? It's DNA profiles from all human bone remains preserved during the exhumation work of the Institute of National Remembrance, and DNA profiles obtained from comparative material from victims' family members. For about 1.5 years, 900 profiles were collected in CODIS IPN, allowing to creation of a unique database in the world. By using the CODIS program, within a few months, another 5 victims of totalitarianism were identified.
Thank you. And now the other project of the same Institute of National Remembrance, Rafał Michliński.
The case of Apolloniusz Duszkiewicz is a very good example to show how the remembrance about the killed soldier survived. In March 1944, during the attack on German stronghold in the village Migunaj, Apolloniusz Duszkiewicz was killed. After many years, without any evidences, no sources in archives, we gain information about the exact place where he was buried. Institute of National Remembrance made an archaeological investigation and we found the body. Then we found the person who might be the family, the relative of Apolloniusz Duszkiewicz, and made the DNA. Thanks to the system CODIS, we brought back the identification of Apolloniusz Duszkiewicz, and thanks to the hospitality of the Lithuanian state, we could bury him properly in September 2021 in Rudomino.
Thank you. And now, on spot, we have Mrs. Elżbieta Moczarska from the Kazimierz and Zofia Moczarski Youth History Clubs.
Hello, I am Ela Moczarska, and I'm here to tell you about the Moczarski Youth History Clubs. Our mission is to teach secondary school students critical thinking, debating skills, and how societies work in an inspiring way. We do this by reading and debating the best books of the modern Polish history, and therefore the modern Polish history experience. Over the last 6 years, our 13 clubs across Poland engaged with over 1,200 students and donated close to 1,000 books to school libraries. We also have a Moczarski Youth History Clubs Award, which we will be having this December for the 6th year. But the clubs and the awards draw inspiration from my father, Kazimierz Moczarski, who was in prison for 11 years for his leading role in Polish resistance. And ironically, my dad shared the cell with the Nazi, General Jürgen Stroop, who was exterminated Warsaw Ghetto. And my dad used this experience to write an important and very influential book on the human condition. I'm very proud of our clubs. I'm very proud to be here to present them. And students read and debate the most complex books and the most layered story of identity, politics, and the human condition. We are working hard to talk to... Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And now we have Chiara Nencioni online.
Is Chiara Nencioni, and this is in European Remembrance Project, born in collaboration with the Florence University, National Institute Ferruccio Parri, and Association Srebrenica City of Hope. The aim of this project is to draw a representative summary of different expressions of violence in various European regions in different moments of the 20th century. The project is divided into 3 sections according to geographic areas. First, Italy and Germany. Since 2008, an Italian-Germany History Commission is working about World War II heritage, memory, history and compensation of Nazi war crimes. Second, Italy and Slovenia, as 2020 was the 75th anniversary of the most significant period of Foibe. We take into consideration the fascist and the Slovenian politics, the forced nationalization of slaves minority, and the brutal Italian occupation and killings of thousands of Italians by Slav partisans. Third, Italian Bosnia, as 2020 was the 25th anniversary of Srebrenica genocide. In order to foster politics of remembrance, an Italian group of Friends of Nature with a returnee created the project Srebrenica City of Hope to promote sustainable tourism in that area. Each topic provides training courses given by historians, lawyers, witnesses, and includes Remembrance travel tours.
Thank you. And now Vincent Regente, Deutsche Gesellschaft.
Hello, thank you. Last time I presented to you my PhD research project, Flight and Expulsion in European Museums, which fortunately could be published last year. Today I have been asked to represent the Deutsche Gesellschaft e.V., the first all-German association founded after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Last year we had the pleasure of celebrating our 30th anniversary together with our federal president. Our aim was and still is to support the German and European integration with civic education. Here you can see our team. Together with civic education, which will enable us to face historical, current and future challenges together. A few examples of our work: media workshops at the former German border, dialogues about the future of the European Union, time witness interviews with victims of communism, conferences against anti-Semitism, summer academies on transitional justice after 1989, exchange projects for journalists, publications, and a lot more. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now I invite Mrs. Katarina Ristfejova from Museum of the Slovak National Uprising.
Thank you very much. I have prepared a presentation. The Museum of the Slovak National Uprising was established to commemorate one of the most important events in Slovak history, an anti-fascist and anti-Nazi resistance. It has its own specialized archives, library, educational and research centers. After its establishment, placing the depositories in the building's basement appeared to be a good and modern idea. Unfortunately, the contrary is true due to the dustiness and occurrence of electrical grinds within the premises of the depository. In 2019, we created a multimedia exhibition with the intention that it will naturally connect with the Open Depository project. The project is financed through the Norwegian grant scheme, and thanks to our partner in Norway, the Nordic War and Peace Center. The Open Depository will store all the collections of the museum in appropriate temperature and humidity conditions. The collections will be divided according to their material groups. Items will have their own QR codes that the visitors will be able to scan through the museum's application. The depository will include a place of work for conservators, and the visitors or school groups will thus be able to observe how museums care for their collections in real time. Our intention is to bring the Museum of the Slovak National Uprising to the 21st century with the cooperation with other institutions, learning from them and inspiring them. So please come visit us in Banská Bystrica, Slovakia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The presentation we will send you online, and it will be as a comment to our YouTube channel. Now I would like to present you the Rafał Wiśniewski and Grażyna Pol from the National Center for Culture Poland, online.
Welcome from Warsaw, from the National Center for Culture Poland. As technology has advanced, virtual reality is gaining in popularity and blinding the creation of realistic images and touching all our senses. In our VR co-productions, Warsaw Rising VR, Victoria 1920 and Cosmogonic, you can immerse in the time and space, becoming not only witness but also participants of events. Our institutions commemorate important anniversaries through art and popularize art through the historical and the social context. We share our exhibitions and educational materials with wide audience. We organize social educational campaigns and strive to spark interest in culture through creative engagement.
Community centers play an important role in the Polish culture policy. The research conducted in the first phase of the pandemic in Poland showed critical success factors for the digital transformation of community centers. In response to this, we launched a special program called Digital Conversion of Culture Centers. It gives the opportunity to purchase hardware and software and provides institutions with the competences necessary to support local engagement in a hybrid world.
Thank you very much. And now Tomasz Trzaska from the Institute of National Remembrance as well online.
Welcome from Warsaw.
Hi, I'm Hanan Salamat from the Coalition for Pluralistic Public Discourse, The CPPD is a network of around 50 intellectuals, artists and academics with diverse backgrounds based in Germany and Switzerland. We are all, in a great variety of ways, working on and researching topics relating to pluralistic culture of remembrance. At the center of this work is the conviction that those who seek to understand the present and the future through the lens of the radical diversity of contemporary societies must also tell the new story of the past. The CPPD seeks to think European culture of remembrance anew and to develop strategies and visions for pluralistic remembrance.
Hello, I'm Max from CPPD. After a first round focusing on the German-speaking sphere and its specificities for pluralistic memory, we are aiming to extend the network to the European sphere next year. Why? Because we believe that the pluralistic society needs to be reimagined, and in order to reimagine the present and the future, you got to go back and revisit the past and tell it anew. So CPTD is going to come to Europe next year. Stay tuned. We're looking forward to see you.
Thank you. And we have Tao Tran, Hanna Salamat and Max Czolek from the Coalition of Pluralistic Public Discourse online. Thank you. And last but not least, it's Oldrich Thoma from Institute of Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences, Center of Memory Studies.
We have documented more than 800 monuments, memorial plaques and memorial artifacts related to the communist regime in the Czech Republic in order to be able to examine characteristic features of the memory of the Czech communism in detail.
Results of the research have been published in this book. Results of the research have been published in this book. The whole documentation is also available on the web. The website permits going through and viewing the memorial places by the region, topic, or a timeline. Our intention is to carry out a similar research project in Slovakia and thus map similarities or differences in the Czech and Slovak memories of the shared past. Maybe sometimes in the future, participate in a broader Central and East European research project to approach the topic of the memorial Central and East European public space from a transnational perspective.
Thank you.